In today's lesson, we are going to review real numbers, and I know you're thinking, aren't all numbers real? We do have some numbers that are not real numbers. So real numbers are broken up into two main categories. Your first category, which is where a lot of your numbers fall, is what we call rational numbers. So again, this should be a review, but let's kind of go through and take a look. I would suggest that you take a minute as we're going through and write these down in your notebook so you have them to reference to. So rational numbers are referring to numbers that can be written as fractions. That can include any decimals that are repeating or terminating. So repeating means, for example, they have that fraction bar over the top of them. So that would be 0.656565, okay? Terminating decimals is referring to 3.25, so it's ending. Terminating means that it's ending. So even though we say numbers that can be written as fractions, you have to also think that we can change these decimal numbers into a fraction form even though they're not written that way currently. -5, for example, again, not written as a fraction right now, but it can be written as a fraction by simply placing it over 1. So rational numbers, that's your first category of numbers. Again, write it down in your notes. Second main category under real numbers is what we call irrational numbers. So irrational numbers are any real numbers that can't be expressed as a fraction of two integers. That's going to include any numbers that are not considered perfect squares. So again, I realize that we're asking you to think about what is a perfect square. Perfect squares is going back to your square roots. So if you think about what is the square root of 25, most of you know square root of 25 is 5. That's considered a perfect square. Square root of 16 is 4. That's considered a perfect square. But if I throw a number at you like the square root of 7, that's not a perfect square. We don't know what that is off the top of our head. We would have to plug that into your calculator. So here's some examples of some irrational numbers. Perfect one that we can think of is pi, because pi is a decimal number that goes on forever. We cannot put that in a fraction form, even though sometimes we use the approximation, okay, fraction for it. It is not actually able to put it in a fraction form. So again, a lot of your times when we talk about irrational numbers, we're talking about your numbers that are not your perfect squares. Okay, so the first thing we want to do when we look at a number is we want to decide, does it fit into this rational category or is it fit into your irrational category? Then you're going to hear throughout the year, all year, we're going to talk about integers. And you guys have talked about integers a lot throughout the last couple of years. So now we got to think about what are examples of integers. So take a second, look at your choices A, B, and C. Think about which one you would pick. Which one of those three are all considered integers? You should be looking at letter B. Letter B, those are all considered integers. So here is our reason why. When we talk about integers, here's what we're looking at. Integers have to be whole numbers, positive and negative, and it includes our 0. So by whole numbers, we're saying there's no fraction or decimal pieces. And again, I would write this down in your notes because you're going to need to know the difference between these categories of numbers. Okay, so no fraction decimal pieces, but your integers are including both your positive and your negative numbers. Okay, whole numbers, simply again, meaning you have no fraction or decimal parts, okay? But your whole numbers, again, are starting at your 0. So 0 on up, all positives. And then we move into what's called our natural numbers, sometimes referred to as your counting numbers. So just think about when you're a kid and you start learning to count. What do we start counting with? We start with the number 1. So your counting numbers are starting at number 1. The only difference between your whole numbers and your natural numbers or your counting numbers is that your whole numbers include your 0. Your natural numbers starts at 1. It does not include the 0. That is the only difference between these two categories of numbers. Okay, so We've got 5 vocab terms so far that we need to know. We have to know the difference between rational and irrational. You also need to know the difference between an integer, a whole number, and a natural number. Okay? Sometimes you'll see this chart, and sometimes it's set up a little bit different, but under this big umbrella of real numbers, we split either you are rational or you are irrational. Okay? If you identify a number as an irrational number, it falls into none of these other categories. Okay, so if it's an irrational number, you identify it as irrational and then you are finished. If, however, you identify a number as a rational number, you have to also check then to see, is it an integer? So if it's an integer, then you keep going down your chart here and you say, okay, well then is it a whole number? And if it's a whole number, okay, is it a natural or a counting number? Okay, and it can go the opposite way too. If you know when you look at a number, I know it's a whole number, you have to identify it as everything that is above it. So a whole number is going to be considered an integer and a rational number and a real number. Okay, so again, that chart can kind of help you figure out how you piece numbers together in terms of what category they belong to. I would again write the chart down in your notes. Some people will do this a little bit different, but again, there's a couple different ways you can have it, but again, I think this will help you kind of figure out how do these all fit together. All right, so we're going to say classify. Classify, again, is just asking you to name. So as you look at these 5 names, we have to name what category that number belongs into. So if we have negative 2.5, first thing you're going to do, again, is it rational or is it irrational? I have to try to decide which one does it fit into. So again, think about irrational, we said decimal number, okay, kind of going on forever was what our pi did. That's definitely not what this one does. It's an ending or a terminating decimal. So it's going to fit into that rational number. If it's rational, remember, go down that chart that you just had, then we have to look and see, does it fit into any of these other numbers? Well, integer, it's got a negative, but look, it's got that decimal piece. So because it has that decimal piece, it's not considered an integer, which means we are just going to list it as a rational number, and that is it. Okay, negative 8 over 2. Remember that fraction bar there means divide. So before I can actually classify what this is, I have to simplify that. I have to know what is its equivalent. Negative 8 over 2 is equivalent to negative 4. So I'm really working there with a negative 4. Negative 4 is going to be considered a rational number because I can write it in a fraction form. So again, I'm going to go on to those other categories and see which ones does it fit into. Negative 4 is an integer. So I'm going to move to the next one. Is it a whole number? Well, whole numbers can't be negative, so I'm not going to list whole number, which means for negative 8 over 2, I should be listing a rational and an integer. Okay, square root of 17. So again, we talked about perfect squares. Perfect squares are those numbers that we should know we can take the square root of, and we should know those in the top of our head. Okay, and so think about that one. Do you know that off the top of your head, or you ask yourself what number times itself gives me 17? And most of us probably can't think of that. So that one is an irrational number. If I put that in my calculator, it's going to give me a decimal number that goes on and on and on and on. Square root of 49. What number times itself gives me 49? Most of us are going to be able to identify that's a 7. So 7 is a rational number. I can put it in a fraction form. It's an integer. It's a whole number. And it would be a number that I count with, or a natural number. So square root of 49, its equivalent, I should be able to list all 4 of those categories. Okay, so I'm going to put some of these up here, and I want you to try them. So classify, so hopefully you have your classification table that you're looking at. Again, first thing, rational or irrational, and then if it's rational, go down your list and see what you can classify it as. Okay, correct answer, you should have selected letter C, rational, integer, whole number. It is not a natural number because we do not count with 0 when we first start counting, okay? Let's take a look at another one. 13.5. Look at those answer choices. See which one you would select. Correct answer for this one is letter D, rational. It is only rational because it has the decimal piece. Decimal piece does not allow it to fit into the integer, the whole number, or the natural number category.